Hello, I'm Mr. Brown down in A-Flight with another mini lesson. Today I'd like to talk about Aimpoint, transition to landing, and landing. What I'm going to cover today is applicable to both your contact sorties and your instrument sorties. But before I get started, let's talk about a typical landing for a moment. So I'm going to act like a math teacher here for a few moments and have you think back to your high school Algebra 2 class where you talked about a decreasing exponential function, because that's what landing an airplane is like. My function comes down rather quickly, and then it begins a round out where it transitions, takes that downward momentum or velocity, and it starts to level it out horizontal. Now, the bottom axis here is what we call an asymptote. What that asymptote is my exponential function will get closer and closer to that, but it never touches. And that's what landing an airplane is like. We're coming down final, and at some point we need to transition our downward momentum to a horizontal momentum. We need to start some round out, and then we get into our flare, where we try to hold it just inches above the runway and let the airplane run out of airspeed, and then eventually it will settle down, hopefully somewhat gently on the runway. So landing an airplane is kind of sort of like math. So let's come back here and talk about Aimpoint, transition to landing, and landing. Right, in contact, you first start off and learn how to do a normal straight in. You then eventually learn how to do a normal overhead final, or a normal overhead. The final turn, right as you roll out on final, from that point on, it's just like the last little part of a normal straight in. So I'm going to talk as if we're doing a normal straight in. Now, AETC Manual 11248 says for a normal straight in, when we reach our start descent point, we want to lower our nose, put our aim point halfway up the windscreen. Now let's define what an aim point is. Aim point is the spot on the runway that if you do nothing, if you don't change your pitch, if you don't flare, you do nothing but hold what you have, that is where you're going to impact the runway. Problem I have with 11248's explanation is halfway between what? When you say halfway up the windscreen, what is that halfway between? Exactly where in our sim does that windscreen hit the fuselage? Because it's halfway from that point to the canopy bow. What does halfway look like? Is this halfway or is that halfway? Well, halfway matters, because if it's slightly above or below where it needs to be, then I'm either going to aim long and land long, or I'm going to land short. Depending on your seat height, if you sit high, then your aim point is going to be lower. If you sit low, your aim point is going to be higher. So all of these things matter. So when I talk about putting my aim point halfway up the windscreen, sure, I'll do that, but then I have a backup way that I analyze to figure out if that is the right spot. Now, maybe we should quickly mention that on the straight in level flight at 1,300 feet, I'm at 105 knots, I'm configured. I've got 27% on my torque, and I'm about 3 degrees nose high. Contact, normal straight in, we tend to use a 4-degree glide path. So when I get to my start descent point, I want to lower my nose 4 degrees. Again, there's math involved. If I'm 3 degrees nose high, minus 4 degrees, I should be 1 degree nose low. And I pull my power back to 16% coming down final. So let's do this aim point a slightly different way here. Consider you're driving your car and you're trying to get on the interstate. You're on one of those cloverleaf loop things, and as you're coming up to get on the interstate, you look over and you see a semi is in the right lane. How do you know if you have spacing on that semi? How do you know if you're going to hit him or go in front of him or go behind him? That's the concept of aim point. So if you'll pardon my crude drawings here, please don't laugh, but this is supposed to be your driver's side window. As I look out at that blue dot semi, if I see the semi is moving forward in my window, I have what we call lag pursuit. I'm going to lag and go behind him. If he is moving backwards in my window or moving aft in my window, then I have what we call lead pursuit. I'm going to take the lead. I'm going to go in front of him. Problem arises when he's not moving in my window. As I get closer, he's just getting bigger and he's not moving. You're going to hit him. That's what we call pure pursuit. And that, to me, is the concept of what an aim point is. An aim point is where you're going to hit if you do nothing. It's that spot that doesn't move. It doesn't go aft or forward. It doesn't go up. It doesn't go down. It just stays in the same spot on your window and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's what I typically use for my approaches and landings. So look at another set of my crude drawings. This is supposed to be our windscreen with a canopy bow. I put my aim point. Now, if I haven't mentioned that, let's talk about that for a second. For a contact sortie, the point I want to aim at is the threshold of the runway, what a lot of us will call brick 1 of the runway, the first brick, the very beginning. So I'm going to put that threshold halfway up my windscreen, and I'm going to wait for a couple seconds, and I'm going to watch it, and I'm going to analyze it. If I see that threshold is moving up in my windscreen, then that means I'm aiming below it. I'm going to get low, what we call drug in, and I'm going to land short of the runway. In case you're curious, that would be bad. Now, second picture here. Lower my nose, put that aim point about halfway up. Notice I'm saying about halfway. And I see that that threshold is starting to move down in my windscreen. That means I'm aiming past the threshold. I'm going to get high. If I lower my nose to get back to where I should be, I'm going to be steep, and steep is also bad. When I get steep, I pick up a pretty hefty downward vector that I may not be able to fully arrest and transition to that horizontal. So problem with being steep, we tend to get fast, so we pull our power back. So now I'm in a situation where I don't have much power in, and as I try to do that round out and flare, I don't have the power to do it. My airspeed rapidly decreases, and I wind up landing short of the runway. So we don't want to be steep either. Now this third picture, that's the perfect aim point. I put that threshold about halfway up my windscreen, and I watch it for a second or two, and I see that it's not moving. It's not going up, it's not going down. It's just getting bigger. That is what we're looking for when we talk about an aim point. In the first picture then, if I see my threshold is moving up in my windscreen, then I need to pick my nose up and move that threshold back down where it should be. If I see my threshold is moving down, my aim point's moving down in my windscreen, then I need to lower my nose. Now, I only want to do that though if I'm far enough out that I have plenty of altitude to make the correction and transition back to a normal glide path. If it's late in the final approach, I might just want to do a go around. And then of course, if it's perfect, I don't need to do anything. I just make sure I continue to hold it there. All right, over in instruments. It's basically the same concept. The biggest difference is the aim point that I'm using. In instruments, we are not going to use the threshold of the runway as our aim point. The reason for that is pretty simple. Typically, when we have weather roll in, we have low cloud ceilings, we have reduced visibility. With that reduced visibility, I don't have all of the visual cues, the peripheral cues that I'm used to having for my approach. So it's very easy to pick up a sink rate, start to descend a little too quickly without realizing it. So we don't want to aim for the threshold because there's no margin of error. So I need to figure out for an instrument approach, where did the people that wrote the instrument approach, where did they design my aim point to be? Best way to do that, I look down in the profile section and I find a little note there where it says GP, glide path, 3.00 degrees. Okay, this ILS is a 3-degree glide slope. Right underneath that, it says TCH 50. That stands for threshold crossing height of 50 feet. Now, I can do a couple things here. I can just ignore that, and I'll just keep my glide slope centered all the way down, and that should take care of it. Well, it's not that easy. As we get closer to the runway, that beam gets more narrow and more narrow. It becomes more sensitive, and it becomes a lot more difficult to keep everything perfectly centered up. So, better would be to calculate what we call the runway point of runway point of intercept. Okay, where will I impact the runway if I do nothing? Where is that aim point? So we can calculate that. If we use the fact that it's a 3-degree glide path and a threshold crossing height of 50, and our favorite little rule called the 60-to-1 rule, we can figure this out. So 60-to-1 rule says that for a 3-degree glide path, I will lose 300 feet in 1 nautical mile. Nautical mile is 6,000 feet. Well, that's nice, but my threshold crossing height is 50. Well, 50 is 1/6 of 300. So let's take 1/6 of 6,000. So if I cross that threshold of the runway at 50 feet in the air, the runway point of, and use a 3-degree glide path, that runway point of intercept is 1,000 feet down the runway. So think about your instrument markings on the runway. At the very edge, the approach end, we have what we call the piano keys, or at least I call them the piano keys. What that actually tells us is the number of stripes on just 1/2 the runway tells us how wide the runway is. I don't want to get into that right now, though. 500 foot down, we have 3 stripes on each side. That's our 500-foot marker. And then 1,000 foot down, we have 1 big white rectangle on each side. A lot of people refer to those as the captain's bars because that's what they kind of look like. Now, PAPIs. Unless there's a note in the profile section on the instrument approach plate that says otherwise, those PAPIs will use the same threshold crossing height and have the same runway point of intercept as the ILS has. So that will be something else I can use as I get a little bit closer. And typically, if you ever look, you're going to notice those PAPIs are generally right around 1,000 foot with a threshold crossing height of 50. All right, so what does that mean to me in instruments? Well, if I'm flying a precision approach like an ILS, when I break out of the weather, I want to keep flying my glide slope on my instruments, but as I start to acquire the runway, I want to see what point on the runway is not moving. Point is just getting bigger. If it's a 3-degree glide path and a threshold crossing height of 50 feet, it should be the captain's bars that are just getting bigger. For non-precision, once I'm at my VDP. Now, a VDP, we always calculate a VDP using a 3-degree glide path. That's what the FAA wants us to use. So irregardless of what glide path the ILS uses, we're always going to use a 3-degree. So if I'm at level flight, 3 degrees nose high and 35%-ish, when I start to descend at my VDP, I want to lower my nose 3 degrees. So that's going to put me at 0 degrees of pitch, or what we call line on line. And I want to use the same runway point of intercept as the ILS has. If the VDP is published, they are using the same runway point of intercept as the ILS. So if it's a threshold crossing height of 50 feet and 3 degrees, then they're planning on you impacting 1,000 foot down. So as you lower your nose at the VDP to come out of the MDA, pick up those captain's bars, put them halfway up the windscreen. Actually, this is a 3 degree, not a 4 degree, so it's probably just a little above halfway. But make sure that they're not moving, they're just getting larger. Now, as I get a little bit closer there, of course, I start seeing the pappies. I can use those. Looking for 2 white, 2 red lights. They should be right abeam that if it's a 50, wherever the runway point of intercept is, the pappies will use the same. If it's 50 feet, then that's 1,000 feet down, okay? One thing we don't want to do here is duck under. That's very dangerous. In other words, I don't want to drop that aim point to the threshold like I do with contact. Again, I have reduced visibility. It's hard to see that I have a sink rate going. I may not notice it, and quite often in history, people have landed short of the runway because of that. So do not duck under. If that runway point of intercept is 1,000 feet, that's where you should be aiming. All right, let's talk about transition to land here for a moment. In contact, we don't call it transition to land. That's actually an instrument term, but it's still really the same thing. In contact, a lot of instructors use a phrase called crack, shift, flare. When I am 1,000 foot short of my aim point, I want to crack my power. Now remember, this is contact, so I was using 16%. I want to crack that power back about 8 to 10%. 11 would be okay, 12 might be a little high. 8 might actually be a little low itself, but somewhere right around 10%. Now remember, the PCL and a T6, very small PCL movements result in large torque changes. That's why the word, it literally is crack it. We're not really moving it, okay? Just a little crack, maybe throw an eyeball over on the torque. As long as you're somewhere around 8 to 11, that should work for us. What we're doing by doing that is we're coming down final at 105 knots. We're supposed to cross the threshold at 95 knots. So that's what the crack is for. It's to help us lose 10 knots in the next 1,000 feet. Now, once we are at the, let me point out, at Randolph, our overrun is 1,000 foot long. So if I'm at Randolph, that 1,000 foot prior to the threshold is as I cross over the front edge, the leading edge of the overrun. That's where I'm going to do my crack. Now, 500 foot short of my aim point, this is where I'm going to start my round out. I want to shift our eyes down to, some people say the horizon, some people will say the end of the runway. It's pretty close to the same thing. It's probably not going to matter a whole lot which of those you use. I tend to use the horizon myself. But what we're trying to do there is, that's the start of the round out. That's where we're trying to take that downward momentum of our decaying, decreasing exponential and try to start to transition that to a horizontal motion. Typically, our hand, the control stick, tends to move wherever our head and our eyes go. So by looking up and shifting my eyes down to the horizon, the far end of the runway, what we're looking for is to just gently pick that nose up just a little bit. We're shifting our aim point from the threshold down to about the 500 to 750 foot down the runway. As the horizon starts to fill up our windscreen, this is the start of the flare, okay? Now, if you don't know what this looks like, before you take off next time, while you're still sitting in the EOR, before you call tower, take a moment and start looking around outside. Look at where the horizon is. Look at how high up it is. Maybe try to find something on the canopy bow that you can use to judge, or notice how much of what you see is ground and how much of it is sky. Because with the flare, as the horizon approaches that means I'm getting close to the runway. Then we do our flare. In the flare, we're going to check and make sure that we're in idle, and we're just going to slowly start picking that nose up towards the horizon. The perfect landing picture is the same as your takeoff picture, the spinner on the horizon. Now remember, we're losing another 10 knots here, so total of 20 knots here during this landing. So this entire time, we still need to be trimming nose up. That'll help us with pulling the stick back. So keep trimming. Check that you're in idle. And then I call it walking the spinner down the runway, okay? I'm gonna pick the nose up and move that spinner a little further down, until it's either at the end of the runway or it's on the horizon, preferably on the horizon, my takeoff picture. If we've done this right, the airplane is only 2 or 3 inches above the ground. And as it runs out of flying airspeed, it just settles nice and gently to the runway. That's what we're looking for. Now, in instruments, we call it transition to landing. In your pre-brief, you have a section where you're supposed to talk about transition to landing. And let me tell you, it's more than simply saying, I'm going to transition at the rate at which I get my ground references. There's a lot more to it than that, and you need to brief more than just that. First off, where do you expect to break out of the weather? If you get the ATIS, excuse me, if you get ATIS and it says it is 600 overcast and you're back at Randolph, you know that field elevation's about 750, 761 to be exact. So at 600, I should be breaking out somewhere between 1,300 and 1,400 feet on my altimeter. So I want to know what to expect. As I approach that altitude, I'm going to start looking up, doing what I call the prairie dog. Pop my head up and take a look. Start looking for that runway. On a precision approach, say an ILS, if I break out of that weather and I am above my decision altitude, I'm not going to immediately go visual. I'm going to stay on that glide slope all the way down to my decision altitude. After all, I have a gauge that's helping me and telling me how I'm doing with my aim point, so I might as well use that for as long as I can. What I will do, though, is look out. I can look at the runway and figure out if I need crosswind controls. Do I need to slide a little left, a little right, get on center line? So I'll still look outside and I'll make those corrections. And I'm also going to watch to see, is that runway point of intercept not moving in my windscreen? And I want a good continuity with that so that when I reach my decision altitude and I go purely visual outside, I'm ready and able to hold that aim point. As far as a crack shift flare, that still applies here. Remember, if my threshold crossing height is 50 feet, my runway point of intercept is 1,000 foot down. So basically, all we're going to do here is move that contact crack shift flare 1,000 foot down the runway. What that means is, as I cross the threshold, I'm going to crack my power back to 8 to 10%, keep the airplane coming down. At the 500 foot marker on the runway, I'm going to shift my eyes to the horizon let that nose come up slightly, shift that aim point a little bit further down. And then as the horizon starts to fill up my windscreen, I'll check an idle, and I'll slowly keep trimming, but I'll slowly walk that spinner down and try to get it up on the runway so that I touch down at 85 knots, just like in contact. Now, on a non-precision, things can be a little bit different when we talk about visual descent points or VDPs. If a VDP is specified on your instrument approach plate down in that profile view, then it uses the same threshold crossing height that is published there. So you can do the math and you can figure out where that VDP is aiming you. So if I break out of the weather before my VDP, I just keep driving in at my MDA. I don't do anything. I make some left and right adjustments, of course, think about my crosswind controls. I start looking at other things to notice trend information, but I do not start my descent until I get to my visual descent point. It should not be a, oh, I'm at the VDP, I think I'll descend. I'm waiting, and the instant I hit the VDP, I already know, and I'm already ready to start that descent. Remember, it's 3-degree glide path, so it's going to be about line on line. That also sounds like 21% on my torque. And I'm aiming for that runway point of intercept. Most likely the captain's bars, if that threshold crossing height is somewhere around 50. If I'm inside the VDP, when I first see the runway, then I know that I'm going to be steep. Remember, we don't want to duck under. We don't want big, steep, hefty descent gradients. As long as my runway is long enough, and you should already know that by the time you get there, then I will look out, pick something on the runway that approximates, looks like it might be a good 3-degree glide path, and I'll use that for my aim point. If I can't do that because the runway is too short, then it's time for a go-around / missed approach. Now, the other part of this problem is, what if the VDP is not calculated for you and you calculate your own? Now, we know how to do that, right? Gus wears a hat. So height above touchdown divided by glide slope. What that gives you is the distance from the threshold, from the edge of the runway. So if you calculate your own VDP, your runway point of intercept is the threshold. Be aware of that. We don't want that, though. It's okay to calculate that and to start down, but as you get a little bit closer, highly suggest, highly recommend that you shift that aim point down 500, maybe that normal 1,000-foot down. Give yourself that buffer zone. So maybe a better way to calculate your VDP to use the normal runway point of intercept. To do that, we take our threshold crossing height, and I believe, check my math on this because I sometimes do this backwards, we add the threshold crossing height to our height above touchdown, then divide by a 3-degree glide path. That will give you, and you can check that against one that's already calculated. You should come up with the same number. So what that will do then is allow you a much better runway point of intercept. You cross that threshold at the calculated, the preferred threshold crossing height. Life will be a lot easier for you. So there's a little bit on Aimpoint, transition to land and landing, contact and instrument. I hope you find, and a little bit of a math refresher too, by the way. I hope you find it helpful. Hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, make sure you find an instructor, ask those questions, get your answers, make sure you understand how to do this stuff. If no one is around to talk to you, come on down to A-Flight. I'm almost always there. My name is Mr. Brown. Happy flying.